Today I'm super excited to be sharing with you 3 different sourdough recipes that are my very favorites that I've come across so far. Now, I haven't been doing sourdough all that long. I am also not a very rocket science type of person, and so if I can make these recipes and they turn out most of the time, then you're pretty much guaranteed to be able to make these recipes. The only thing that I've learned with sourdough that is a little bit more difficult is the fact that it just takes a lot longer to prepare. So just keep that in mind, and I'm really excited to jump into these recipes. Diving in, this first recipe is the best bread recipe that I've ever found because it really holds up even as you're cutting through the loaf. And the other wonderful thing about this bread recipe is that if you start it in the morning, you can work on it throughout the day periodically, and it's hot and ready to be served by dinner time, which is perfect. Okay, for this first type of bread, you are going to need sourdough, flour, stevia or some type of sweetener, salt, water, butter, and milk. Okay, so once you've collected all your ingredients, you're going to start out by adding 1 cup of starter to a bowl. And to that, you are going to add a 1/2 cup of water and 1/4 a cup of milk. Then stir that all together and add 1 tablespoon of butter. Or of course you can use coconut oil or olive oil. Next, I like a sweet bread, and so I add a couple drops of stevia, or the original recipe actually calls for a tablespoon of honey, or you can use maple syrup. You can skip the sweetener, or you can even add sugar. Next, you're gonna add 2.5 to 3 cups of flour. I prefer using a organic white flour, but it's totally up to you. And you're gonna stir this until you have a really soft, nice consistency of dough. If you're really swift like me, you will also use a whisk and have the joy of trying to clean the whisk out when you're done. Before I add the salt, I'm actually going to let this dough rest for 1/2 hour in the bowl. So once you got it all mixed up and you've let it rest for 1/2 hour, I like to use these silicone baking mats to knead my bread on, just because it keeps my counters from getting all that dough stuck to them. It's really hard to clean off. Then I just add flour to the silicone mat, and if my dough is a little bit on the harder side, I'll usually knead it with olive oil, and if it's a little bit on the softer, stickier side, I'll knead it with flour. So you put the dough on the mat, I flatten it out, and you add about a teaspoon of salt sprinkled across the top of your dough, and then you're going to knead in that salt for about 5 minutes. You can tell when your bread dough gets kind of this elasticy feeling. You can feel the difference in the dough as it really starts to stick together. It gets more stretchy, and that's when you know it's ready to put in a floured bowl and let set for 4 hours. Also, I highly encourage you to either cover it up with a damp cloth or else plastic wrap so it doesn't get dried out on the top of the loaf. Okay, so now those 4 hours have passed. I dump the dough out. I knead it one more time for about 5 minutes, and then I shape it into a loaf and put it in a oiled loaf pan. Then I put it somewhere warm, which for me is by the stove, and I like to cover it with a piece of plastic wrap to make sure it doesn't get dry and crusty on the top. And I'm gonna let it rise one more time until it's about double its original size. After that, you're just going to take the plastic wrap off, and you are going to slit the top if you want to, and you're going to bake it at 375 for around 20 to 25 minutes or until it's golden brown, and you will have the most delicious, least sour, most fabulous tasting sourdough bread you have literally ever had in your life. This is my favorite bread recipe. It's amazing. So enjoy. Now that you have the most delicious loaf of bread ever, I want to share another fabulous recipe, and this is for biscuits. These are so good. For this recipe, you're going to need milk, starter, salt, stevia, flour, baking powder, baking soda, and butter. Now, this biscuit recipe is by far the best biscuit recipe in the entire world, in my opinion. The only thing to consider is that it does take a total of 24 hours to make, which is kind of a bummer. But believe me, it is so worth it, and you get most of the work done the very first day. So to get started, you add 2 1/4 cups of flour to a bowl, and to that you are going to add a total of 6 tablespoons of cold butter. I like to just use a butter knife and chop mine up a little bit and then use my fingers to kind of knead it into the dough. But if you don't do it that way, you can also put it in like a food processor and blend it up that way until the butter has really been incorporated into the flour and is just very small pieces. After that, you're just going to add 1 cup of milk and 2/3 cup sourdough starter. You're just going to stir all that up, and then you're going to put plastic wrap over the entire thing and stick it in the fridge until 24 hours is passed. Okay, so back to the biscuits. It has now been about 24 hours, and I take the biscuit dough out of the fridge, put it on a well-floured surface, and then you're going to kind of flatten it out or use a rolling pin and roll it out a little bit. And on the top, you are going to carefully sprinkle 1 1/2 teaspoons baking powder, 1/2 teaspoon baking soda, and 1/2 teaspoon salt onto the top of the dough. You kind of press that in, and then you can start rolling it out. And this is what makes these biscuits so incredible. They are like 100 layers of just super flaky, delicious dough. So you're going to start by folding your dough into thirds. So you're going to fold it into the center, and then you're going to take the other side, fold it into the center, and roll it out. After you have it completely rolled out the first time, you're going to do it again, grabbing one side, pulling that edge all the way into the center of the dough, grabbing the other side and pulling it all the way over the last fold that you did. And you're going to then roll it out again and repeat this process a total of about 3 or 4 times. After you've done this fold and roll several times, then when your dough is about 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch thick, I just like to use a small mouth mason jar ring to cut out the biscuits, but use whatever size you have, whatever you want to do. And then you just kind of shape them, make sure that they're round, put them on a pan, and you're going to bake them at 425 for around 20 minutes. You guys, don't those look amazing? They have so many layers and they are so good. Okay, before I speak on the last recipe, which I'm going to call the Sarah's version of traditional sourdough bread, I want to give a quick caution. To anyone out there who knows how to make traditional sourdough bread correctly, you're probably going to be mortified because I'm going to break like every rule of how to make sourdough bread correctly that you'll find in any YouTube video. But the reason why is because to this day, I find the amount of steps most people have to do, while I'm sure their bread is amazing, I find it daunting and overwhelming, and it makes me not want to make sourdough. So this is super simplified, my own version. I do not use a scale. I do not measure. I just add until it looks right, until it's the right texture and consistency. And my husband and I love this sourdough bread so much, and I get compliments on it. So it looks beautiful, it tastes great, but it's not correct. So with all that being said, let's dive in. YouTube videos that I've watched always recommend with this particular type of sourdough that you start with a fed starter. However, I have to confess, part of the time I literally feed my starter when I start making this bread, and I'm sure sourdough connoisseurs can tell the difference. I have not personally noticed the difference. So I'm going to start out by adding around 3 cups of flour. Like I said, I don't measure anything when I cook because I'm not that type of person. And then I add around approximately 1 1/4 cup water. I mix those 2 things together using my hands, and I'm just looking for a soft but not like sloppy consistency. So usually I start this particular sourdough in the evening after the kids are in bed. So if I'm really tired, I just immediately go on to the next step and add the sourdough starter. If I have a little bit of time though, I will let the flour set with the water for about 20 minutes so that the flour gets really hydrated first. Then I'm going to add the starter, which I add about 2/3 to 3/4 a cup of starter, and kind of use my hand as a scoop to mix it all together to incorporate it and also to make some potential air bubbles in the dough. Now, after I've stirred this up for a little while, I do a super brief stretching session with the dough, but it's nothing crazy. Like I said, I'm very simple, and I like how this bread turns out as it is. Okay, so you've incorporated the starter into the flour and water. The next thing you're gonna do is add about half a teaspoon of salt. So I just put the dough on my counter and add the salt and then kind of knead it in. And this is when I do any stretching and pulling that I'm going to do to the dough. And I don't go back and do it multiple times like everyone else does. I do it once or twice, and I think it's good enough. Okay, so the next step is the easiest one, and that is to just let your dough set for the next 7 to 12 hours. So if it's really warm, I don't have to let my bread rise as long because the warmth that just really helps it to rise quicker. So there's 2 different options of things that I've tried when it comes to letting my dough rise for this particular bread. The first is just taking parchment paper, layering a bowl or a dish, coating your bread with lots and lots of flour because it does have a real tendency to stick, and then putting it in the bowl and letting it rise there. The other option is using kind of like a bamboo basket. I don't actually remember the name of them, but I'm sure they're easy to find, and coating it super well with flour. Make sure you put enough flour on it and coat your dough as well, or it will stick. So once it's coated with flour, it's put in the container or in the bowl, and it's risen to the amount that you'd like it to rise to, 7 to 12 hours. Then in my particular case, I'm using that bamboo basket. I dump it out, put it onto a piece of parchment paper. You don't have to use parchment paper, you can just use flour, but I have found I prefer the parchment paper. And then I use a little razor blade. This razor blade has a handle, but I've found with the handle, it actually makes it harder to cut for some reason. And I just like to slice a little design. I don't know what I'm doing, but it's fun and beautiful, and it turned out really well. And cut a big deep slit in it, kind of at a maybe 45-degree angle, I think is what that is. And then pop it in the oven to bake. If you like a really crusty outside of your bread, you can put a pot of hot water in the stove and let it just be really steamy while you're baking your bread, and that's supposed to help it be more crusty. I personally don't like when it's super, super hard on the outside because it actually like cuts open my mouth. And so the only thing I do to make it at all more crispy is that I will take the pan that I'm going to be cooking the sourdough in and heat it up along with the oven as it's heating. And once the oven's hot, then I just put the sourdough bread on it, put it in the oven, and I bake it at around 425 for around 25 minutes. But I do check on it often to make sure it's not getting overcooked and to make sure it's cooked enough. Okay, you guys, so there are my top 3 favorite sourdough recipes that I've been making all the time since November. So I hope you try them out and enjoy them. Also, if I can, I'll try and find a link to the sourdough starter that I started with that has just served me really, really well. And it's a really delicious starter, and it's not overly bitter, which I really like. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you hopefully next weekend. Bye-bye.